Colonel Judy A. Greenbaker, United States Army retired, is a graduate of Madison Central High School. She holds a degree in nursing, a Bachelor of Health Science degree in Allied Health Education, and a Master of Arts degree in Community Counseling. Ms. Greenbaker was licensed as a registered nurse in May of 1975 and worked as a staff nurse at Good Samaritan Hospital and the Veterans Administration Hospital in Lexington, Kentucky, prior to her military career. Colonel Greenbaker joined the Kentucky Army National Guard in January 1986 as a second lieutenant. Shortly thereafter, she began working full-time for the Kentucky Army National Guard as the occupational health nurse. The Kentucky Army National Guard has provided Colonel Greenbaker with many opportunities for growth and development. As she progressed through the ranks, Colonel Greenbaker has held many positions in the areas of nursing, military personnel, and human resources. She was an assistant professor of military science with the EKU ROTC program, and Colonel Greenbaker has commanded 3 go-to-war units. She was the chair of the military science department at EKU and ROTC battalion commander in 1998-99. Colonel Greenbaker has spent 7 years on active duty, including several annual training events with units in Germany and South Korea. She retired January 31st, 2013 with the rank of colonel in the United States Reserves after completing almost 28 years of service. Colonel Greenbaker has volunteered countless hours to serving others in her church and in the community. She is currently president of the Friends of Maple Grove Cemetery Group, treasurer of the Concord Homemakers, treasurer of the Richmond Madison County NAACP branch, president, Usher Board of First Baptist Church, and a board member of the Madison County Historical Society. Colonel Greenbaker is the daughter of Leela and Oliver W. Cunningham. She is a lifelong resident of Kentucky and currently resides with her husband, Walter Greene, on the family farm in Madison County. She is the CEO and manager of Lyle Cunningham Farm and Property, LLC. Judy.
Good evening, and thank you very much. Thank you to the Madison County Historical Society for offering me this opportunity to talk to you about the Underground Railroad and a quilt. I want you to know that this story is a story about survival. It's exciting because sometimes it's been hidden. And this story, I tell you tonight, to keep history alive. Because you see that many of the changes that are going on today deal. Before I begin my story, and if you're interested and get a little bit more interested, I want to give you some reference books. First book I have is Hidden in Plain View. This book was done in the 1990s when Miss Tobin went to Charleston, South Carolina, and she met a lady in the marketplace selling Underground Railroad quilts, and she wanted to know more about the story. It took several years to get the story out of Miss Azalea Williams, but this book comes from there. The quilt that I designed here comes from a famous quilter, and her name is Eleanor Burns. If you quilt, what quilters in here? If you quilt, then you know Eleanor. She's very detailed. She took information that she had found and Hidden in Plain View and developed the blocks after they were told to her how we could make it, and I created this quilt. Another interesting book that you might find exciting is by William Steele. He was a conductor on the Underground Railroad for 21 years. He personally welcomed over 649 enslaved people to freedom. But most importantly, he recorded the history of moving from slavery to freedom for over 1,000 people. He published his 800-page book, and this is just a small segment of it. Another interesting book would be Stitches from the Soul. I found this book online, and it's very interesting because it tells about all kinds of quilts. Miss Fry, the author, in particular, I want to show you this quilt. She says that this quilt is hanging in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. It's considered to be a masterpiece. And the 2 slave ladies, Aunt Ellen and Aunt Margaret, lived near Russellville, Kentucky, in Logan County. Another exciting thing in this book is this right here. This is a quilt that was made by 2 slaves. It's an applique quilt, meaning that the pieces were placed on top of the quilt. What's exciting about that is I recently returned from Africa, Egypt to be exact, and I picked up this particular pattern, which is very similar to what was done from the African slaves back in slavery. So this book's very interesting. Also, Black Threads. This is a reference book. If you want to know anything about African American quilting, about where you can find information on the internet, things about the arts, the written and spoken word, it's usually in this book. So it's a very interesting resource to have. So please feel free to look at those after my presentation if there's any that excite you and you would like to look further. As I said earlier, the story of the Underground Railroad is about resilience. It's about survival, and it's about sheer genius. It's a struggle that one may think shouldn't be told because it involves slavery. Again, slavery is part of our history. And for us to understand about the Underground Railroad, we have to understand a little bit about slavery. I want to start by reading a quote to you from William Siebert. He was a Harvard graduate, an educator, and a historian. And he said, and I quote in his book, The Underground Railroad from Slavery to Freedom, he said, "It is the story of a people that possessed intellectual powers and character traits such as courage, determination, love of family, loyalty, self-respect, and dignity that often drove them to flee bondage and to outwit their masters. It is these troublesome characteristics that were misinterpreted in a society in which slavery was considered good and efforts to gain freedom were deemed criminal. The same strong desire of the slaves to be free was the same type of burning desire that drove the Europeans to explore. It drove them to seek wealth, and it drove the Pilgrims to escape from persecution due to religious reasons. American history has labeled anyone trying to self-emancipate as a fugitive, an escapee, a criminal, or a runaway. But tonight, I'm going to teach you a new term. I'm going to teach you the term of freedom seeker, because that honors my ancestors. My great-great-great-grandmother, Emily, was a slave. She was purchased by a man from Kentucky, and she walked from Waycross, Georgia to Kentucky. So tonight, we're going to talk about freedom seekers and how important they were and how important the dream of freedom was to them. We do need to cover just a little bit about the Underground Railroad so that we're all on the same sheet of music before we talk about the quilt. Now, everybody knows or has heard of the Underground Railroad, but you also know that it's not a real railroad. There are no tracks, but yes, there are stations. There are people who help, called conductors. There's all kinds of people along the way, but it's not really a real railroad. Wherever someone was enslaved and desired to be free is where the Underground Railroad started. Now, slavery has existed for over 246 years. And in that time, decade after decade, the desire was still great, and the people who were helping got more deliberate in trying to help them. Historians estimate that 10.7 million Africans were ripped from their country, made a 3-month boat tour, and wound up in the Americas. When they came, they did not come as a blank slate. They brought with them their history, their culture, their own language, and also their religion, and many, many skills. So they came as very talented people. Because it was illegal for them to learn how to read and write, they had to rely on their African culture, that culture of religion, that culture of storytelling, that story of song. And that's how they communicated complex ideas on how to escape to freedom. You see, the Africans knew about art. They knew about cloth and fabric, and they knew how to put those together to make a quilt. And they also knew how to sing. And so with their history together, they put together their ideas and came up with the patterns in these quilt pieces and the stories behind them. So once a group of ladies would sit together and quilt. Of course they did. It was what they always did because they had to make quilts for the big house, but they always made quilts for themselves. So it was not suspicious to see several slaves sitting around and quilting. But what they would do is they would each make a block. And as they made their blocks, they would talk to one another and secretly tell each other what code was in that block. And then after all the blocks were made, it would be put together, as you see over here, in what's called a sampler. A sampler simply means that each block is different, and usually that block means something. Now, I'm sure that many of you have quilts at your house from your relatives, friends, and made them yourself. And most quilts are like this. They're all just one pattern, and that's okay too. And in the Underground Railroad, if you were helping a freedom seeker, you would see a quilt, not like a sampler, but one that was just all one type of pattern. The title Underground Railroad was not coined until 1831. And it was coined by a slave running away in Kentucky. His name was Tice Davids. He left early one morning and he got all the way to the Ohio River, but he was being chased by his master. It got dark. He was hoping when he got to the river that there would be a boat and he would be able to cross very quickly, but that didn't happen. It was dark. The slave master is very close, chasing him. He decides he's not going back to slavery. He's going on to freedom. So he jumps into the Ohio River, and when he gets out into the river, he hears a whippoorwill bird call him. He looks in that direction, and he sees a yellow light in the home of John Rankin across on the Ohio side. So he continues across the water. Now, when the slave master gets to the river, he too doesn't have a boat. So he has to find one. When he finds the boat, then he heads across the river. He can find no trace of Tice anywhere. And when he comes back to Kentucky, he has to come up with a story. So he says, it was as if Tice simply disappeared into thin air and an underground railroad came up and took him away. Now, Kentucky is very important to the Underground Railroad system. And the reason is we are surrounded, on three sides by water: the Mississippi, the Ohio, the Big Sandy and its tributaries. The Ohio River is the difference between slavery and freedom. We also are right across the river from Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio, all free states. So being from Kentucky, or being in Kentucky, or knowing about Kentucky, you have to know about the Underground Railroad, how important it was. The Appalachian Mountains stretch all the way from northern Alabama, all the way 1,500 miles to Maine. So if you're on the East Coast and you're an enslaved person and you have a desire for freedom, you have to cross the mountains. And most likely from the south, you're going to cross over and come through Kentucky. So let's talk about this particular quilt. like my great-great-grandmother, Emily, would talk to me. Let's see if we can find the messages. I'll take this with me so you can hear me in case I turn the other way. Let's see if we can find the messages that might be hidden in a quilt. This first block right here, each of the blocks have a name, and few of them have the same name, depending on where you are within the country. They're given different names. But this first block is called Jacob's Ladder. Now, it's likely came from the Bible. Jacob, in Genesis 28, fell asleep on a stone, and he dreamed about a ladder going from the earth to the heavens. And on that ladder were angels of God, and they were walking up and down the ladder. Now, this block has to do with faith and journeys. It's about going somewhere. You will never see this block hanging on a fence or on a clothesline. It wasn't part of the real code, but it's part of this quilt to talk about the faith that was required for an individual to travel such a dangerous journey. If you see the light and dark blocks, you can see how it looks like steps going upward. This probably meant that it was going to be a long journey, a hard journey. And so grandmother would want us to know it was not going to be easy, but she wanted to encourage us to make sure that our faith was strong and that we were sure that once we set out, we needed to be determined. So this quilt block symbolizes the trip from south to north or from south to out west. Again, you would never see it on a fence. It wasn't part of the Underground Railroad per se. Does anyone know what this is? Anyone know what this is? It is a wrench. What kind of wrench? Do you know the name? It's a monkey wrench. It is a monkey wrench. And the monkey wrench talks about the second quilt that we have here. This quilt. It's called the monkey wrench. The monkey wrench is what the blacksmith used to work on wagons. You see, the blacksmith was the smartest slave on the plantation. And the reason he was so smart was because he would be loaned out to other plantations. He knew the lay of the land. He knew more about the plantation than almost anyone else. He knew the distance, he knew the operation, he knew exactly what was going on. Now, slaves were not allowed to drum because in Africa, the drum sends messages. So the blacksmith had another technique. He would take his hammer. Instead of using the drum, he would use the anvil. The sounds that came from the blacksmith let all the slaves on the plantation know someone is near, someone is far. What's going on? And so that was key for someone going to seek freedom. They had to know as much information as they possibly could. And so this quilt block told them to go see the blacksmith. He can tell you what you need to know. Now, also the blacksmith had to tell you about some tools that you were going to need. Tools that were going to help you survive on your journey. Real tools and mental tools. The real tools were tools to help you either defend yourself, figure out direction where you were going, or even to dig a hole in the ground if you had to hide. But the blacksmith would also remind you of the mental tools that you needed. Because you see, you had to be really smart. You had to be alert. You had to be able to discern that every person you met
Were they going to help you or hurt you? And you had to be ready to react to whatever situation. So the blacksmith, because of his knowledge, would help you with that. A famous blacksmith that you might know is Frederick Douglass. And a quilt just like this, in the shape of the monkey wrench, was found in his house in Washington, D.C. The next block is the carpenter's wheel. And Miss Williams made it very clear to Miss Tobin in the book, Hidden in Plain View, that this was very important. She said, the reason for this quilt piece is you have to be a jack of all trades. You didn't know what you were going to encounter, so you had to be ready for whatever situation came about. The master carpenter to a slave was Jesus. Again, I told you they came with religion. They also were forced to participate in religion on Sunday. So they knew about the master carpenter, Jesus. And frequently, they would sing in the fields about stealing away to Jesus. Steal away, and got long to stay. My Lord, he calls me by the thunder. When the green trees are bending and the tombstones are bursting, just steal away. Well, the master would think that they're talking about dying, but that wasn't it at all. It was springtime, and it was time to board the railway and steal away. When the trees are young and bending, it's springtime. When the tombstones are bursting, that's when your desire to be free is strongest. So the song went along with the block, and they sang it as they worked in the fields. Now, also with the carpenter's wheel, the one thing, not everyone to freedom went north. It was a sign that you could go westward to free territory. You could follow the wagon trains and go west to Nebraska. The next block is the wagon wheel. And the wagon was so important to a freedom seeker because it was the primary mode of transportation. The wagons generally had a false bottom so they could hide in the wagon. And it was also a message for you to pack like you were packing a wagon. There's not much space. There won't be much space. There'll be just you and what little bit you can carry. Also, they would sing a song called Swing Low, Sweet Chariot in the Fields. You know that song, swing low, sweet chariot. Swing low, sweet chariot. You know that song. Well, what they were talking about was not a chariot coming to take them again to heaven, but a chariot that was coming, probably a conductor on the Underground Railroad. They were in the area, they would be coming soon. Another interesting thing about the wagon were sunbonnets and bandanas. Many of you probably have seen this sunbonnet. Had grandmothers who wore them, right? You've seen this before, a sunbonnet? Well, the difference between sunbonnets and bandanas is that indentured servants and slaves wore bandanas. If you were above that status, you wore a bonnet. And a story is told about a minister in Nebraska. You know, he traveled a lot. He was up and down the road quite frequently, usually 2 or 3 times a week. And what he would do is he would take his wagon, he would have 2 ladies sitting beside him with their bonnets on, and he would leave and go up the road. A couple of hours later, you would see him coming back with 2 ladies. Now, if you take this bonnet with its long brim and you pull it down on your head, you can really cover up most of your face. And from the side, you won't hardly see anything. So what was happening were the freedom seekers were getting a ride on the wagon. They would put their heads down, pull that bonnet down, and he would drive on. And no one ever noticed that the two ladies coming back were brown complexion. This quilt pattern is called Birds of the Air, and it talks about flight and migration and freedom. And you would see it at a safe house. You follow the birds as they are migrating north. You'll find food and water. And also, there was a secret code inside the block. If you look not at the colors and not at the birds, but the white arrows, you can see that they point downward in this particular fashion. But if you had a quilt and you wanted someone to go left or right, you would simply turn the block in the direction in which you wanted them to travel. It usually meant that there was a safe house nearby and they could find it. This block is called the Bear's Path, and you were literally to follow a bear's tracks. When you saw this pattern, you knew you were on the right track to shelter and to resources. As I told you before, the Appalachian Mountains run 1,500 miles on the eastern side of the United States. So in the spring, between mid-March and mid-April, the bears would come out of hibernation. Their dens and their caves would then be available for you to hide in. And also those bears would walk across the forest and the mountains in the easiest manner, and they would stop and eat berries and food along the way, so you could too find water and food. Also, in the springtime, if you left and followed the bear track, you would be able to tip along, and then maybe, just maybe, it would rain and wash your footprints away, and no one would know that you had gone that way before. So just so that you understand how far these freedom seekers were traveling, I want you to take a look at this United States map. I have Richmond right here in the middle of Kentucky. It's in the middle of the Greene. And I have dotted lines up to Cleveland and Detroit. If you were a freedom seeker and you were able to walk 10 miles a day uninterrupted, and you were headed to Cleveland, it would take 36 days. If you were coming from Charleston, South Carolina, and you were either going to Detroit or Cleveland, it would take 72 days. That's totally uninterrupted, just walking 10 miles a day. But it was much greater danger. If you were coming from Birmingham, Alabama, still another 72 days. So these enslaved people had a great feeling that they could make it to freedom, and thousands of them did, but they didn't realize how far it was. This next zigzag pattern, see the curves and the zigzag? Looks kind of like a staggered drunk who had been drinking all night and is headed home. Hence the name, the drunkard's path. And this was to tell a freedom seeker that they should never walk in a straight line, too easy to track. So they should walk in a staggered pattern, and sometimes they should even double back so that the slave catchers would not be able to follow them easily. Something you could also do, if the slave catcher got too close, all you really had to do was turn around and start walking back toward the south. After all, a slave catcher was looking for someone running and going north. Someone walking south would assume to be just a slave returning to their plantation. This block is called the log cabin, one of the easiest and simplest to make. There's no specific points and things that have to be added on. It's just strips of cloth. And many of you probably have seen it in your household. The key to this block is what's in the center. Normally, it would be red, indicating the heart or the hearth of the cabin. But the secret here is the black center. If you saw this pattern on a fence or on a clothesline, you would know that this was a safe house. This is someplace that you can go and get your baskets refilled. As I spoke earlier about William Steele, he had this pattern on a quilt in Philadelphia with a yellow center, meaning it was a beacon for those who had arrived. Also, this pattern could easily be drawn on the ground. It's one of the few that you would see on the ground. It would lead you to a safe house. This one is called the basket. And a basket that would be used would only be about this size. When you left, again, you had to pack just a little bit. So a sewing basket is all that you would get to use. And then this basket would be refilled along the way, because feeding oneself would be the most difficult task as you traveled northward or westward. You know, you couldn't go into town. You didn't have any money. All your movements had to be secret. And so you would look for this quilt because you knew that you would receive resources and that your basket would be refilled until you got to the next safe house. It's very interesting because abolitionist ladies who assisted freedom seekers couldn't even tell their own children what they were doing for fear that their children might say something to the children they played with. The fine for helping a freedom seeker was $500 or 6 months in jail. So what the lady of the house would do is she would hide the freedom seeker somewhere. Then she would go about doing her chores. She would cook and place food in the bottom of her laundry basket, then cover it up and simply walk up the stairs or down the stairs to wherever the freedom seeker was, fill up the basket, and go back and get more. This block, you probably wouldn't see displayed anywhere, but it pays tribute to all the people who participated in the Underground Railroad. This block is called the shoe fly, and it represents a real person, someone, as I said, who is going to help you along the way. The most famous shoe fly that you know is Harriet Tubman. She was a conductor on the Underground Railroad, but she was also a shoe fly. Now, Harriet is a very interesting person, and I'm sure you've seen lots of movies about her, but there's just a couple of facts that you should know that are new. Harriet never lost anyone on her 19 trips back and forth. I know you've heard that before. But what Harriet liked to do was to leave on Saturday, because some slave owners would let their slaves off on Sunday. So you would have 2 days ahead before the slave owner realized that the person was gone. Also, Harriet was a nurse and a cook and a spy in the Civil War. She worked with Colonel James Montgomery, and she went down to Charleston, South Carolina. She led 150 colored troops from the Union Army. She rescued 750 enslaved people and set them free, and burned a plantation that was producing rice for the Confederate Army. She was buried with full military honors in New York. This patch is called the Flying Geese, and it's also a secret patch that you could show a direction. All 4 of these go in north, south, east, and west. But if you wanted to tell someone which way to go, then you would put 3 of them in the same direction and one that was different. Most of the time, people don't pay attention to those details. But that's how you would show direction. But more importantly, the Canadian goose is the largest bird in North America. They fly in the unique V formation, and they make lots of noises. They stop on an open water area so you could get water, and they eat birds and nuts and seeds, so you'd have something to eat as well. So all you had to do was listen for the Canadian goose and then follow them. They would head north, always north, because they're returning back to Canada. The next quilt block is called the bow tie. And the freedom seeker would be so excited to see this block. The reason being, they were almost to freedom. A shoe fly would meet them, have them stay at a church or a safe place, and then someone would come, a free Black person would come and bring them clothing. You see, when a freedom seeker left enslavement, they were wearing bandanas and slave clothes. They had traveled hundreds of miles, and now they had reached a location where they could move about. But they should not move about in those clothes. They look like runaways. And so they would be brought a brand new suit and a silk bow tie. And this represents the silk bow tie. They would also be taught how to walk around in the city, how to meet and greet other people. And most importantly, they would learn how to walk through town undetected and step on a boat and head on to Canada. Because of the Africans' history, they saw other things in this particular block. The one thing that they saw was the hourglass. And the hourglass to them represented time well spent on a very long journey. And the African Free Society up in the north, they use this as a sign to say you are among friends and you are welcome. The next block is a North Star, the guiding light to freedom. You see, it's the brightest star in the Northern Hemisphere. It never moves, and it aligns specifically over the North Pole. So if you don't know which way to go, all you have to do is find the North Star and walk toward it. You see, civilizations in the past have used the North Star for every bit of their navigation because it never moves and it's always there. This is also important to the boat owners and sailors that would help the freedom seeker get to Canada. They had to know which way was north. That's how they navigated. Another star that was so important to the freedom seeker goes back to the faith that we talked about in the first block. It was the Star of Bethlehem. You know, God put that there for the wise men to find Jesus. So the freedom seekers believed that God had put the North Star in the sky to lead them to freedom. And so they would, behind closed doors, teach the children to follow the drinking gourd. The reason for following the drinking gourd is talking about the Big Dipper. The Big Dipper always points to the North Star because the North Star is the first star in the handle of the Little Dipper. So they would sing very quietly and teach this song. When the sun comes back and the first quail calls, follow the drinking gourd. The old man is waiting for to carry you to freedom. Now that would be a song that they could not sing out loud because it's very clear what the message was. When it's springtime, the quails are out, it's time to leave. Follow the drinking gourd. This block represents a crossroads city. There are two main crossroads cities. The first one is Cleveland, Ohio, and the second one is Detroit, Michigan. If you know your geography, both of these are located on waterways that would take you to Canada. From Cleveland, you simply go up Lake Erie and on to freedom. from Detroit, you would take the Detroit River, then St. Clair, and then on to Freedom. Now, you couldn't call those cities by their real names, so they called Cleveland Hope, and they called Detroit Midnight. Now, when you saw this quilt piece somewhere displayed, you knew where you were. You had reached a decision point. You were either at Cleveland or Detroit. Now, you had to make a decision. You would go on to Canada for sure freedom, or you may stay where you were because you thought that you weren't being chased and not followed. But a decision had to be made at this point, and your life would never be the same again. The last quilt block I'm going to talk about is the boat. And the boat is so important. It's a tribute to the sailors along the way. As I said before, those sailors were going to take you to freedom. The sailors had knowledge of ports and customs, and they knew how to get people from where they were to freedom. They also carried messages up and down the rivers, the Mississippi, up and down the Ohio, as to people who were leaving or coming or whatever was going on. And they were most important in 1850 when the Fugitive Slave Act said, if you were a slave and you were in free territory, you could be captured and returned back. And so those boat sailors, boat people, took many, many people on to Canada. The last block that you will see on the quilt, as designed by Miss Eleanor Burns, is simply a block that explains what the quilt is saying. It's just a few words. It says, the monkey wrench turns the wagon wheel toward Canada. With help from Jesus, the carpenter, follow the bear's trail through the woods. Fill your baskets with enough food and supplies to get to the crossroads. And once you get to the crossroads, dig a cabin in the ground. Shoefly told us to dress up in cotton and satin ties. Follow the flying geese and the birds in the air on the drunkard's path. Take the sailboat across the Great Lakes to the North Star and Canada. So this was put into the quilt so that if you just saw the quilt anywhere, hanging anywhere, that you would understand it was about the Underground Railroad. So in closing, I want to thank you for the opportunity to give you this little bit of history about my quilt and the Underground Railroad. And if you're truly interested in seeing something or some piece of the Underground Railroad, you don't have to go very far. Because in Lexington, Kentucky, there is a safe house in the St. Paul African Methodist Episcopal Church located at 251 North Upper Street. And it's open for viewing by simply calling the church. It was established in 1820, and the room is very small. It's only 6 feet by 10 feet. It's very plain, has white walls, and there's nothing on the floor, and it has a window. And it has stayed essentially the same since 1820. And it's located behind the pulpit. The church has a very rich history in helping enslaved people to make it to freedom. Now, what they would do is they would inform the freedom seeker to walk through dog dung, because there was a dog rescue right next door to the church, because the scent that the slave catchers' dogs were following would be gone before they came to the church. They would stay at the church for 4 or 5 days. Then all of a sudden a bell would ring and they would have 5 minutes. And they didn't have much to carry, so they're not loading luggage. They're simply getting in the back of a cart. And that cart would take them from Lexington, Kentucky to Cincinnati, Ohio. Again, I thank you for this time and this opportunity. And so I hope that this little story about the Underground Railroad helps you understand better the challenges of my ancestors. Thank you.